When I get home from a long day of work, there's nothing I love more than relaxing on the couch and binge watching my favorite shows on Netflix. Netflix has become such a vital part of our daily lives, and its founding story is often celebrated or even fantasized by the media. Whether it was the idea that Netflix was inspired by a late fee or the incredible power of big data in making content decisions, Netflix has etched its place in history as one of the biggest success stories of our time. But in reality, Netflix's founding story is far more humble than many might imagine. Facing stiff competition from rivals like Amazon and Blockbuster, the company was on the verge of bankruptcy several times in its early years before finally hitting on the streaming model that cemented its success. So how did Netflix get started in the first place? And why did it make such a dramatic shift from DVD rentals to streaming content? In today's video, we'll dive into the fascinating story behind Netflix and explore some key moments that shaped this iconic company. When it comes to startup stories about Netflix, one particular popular version goes something like this. One day in the late 90s, CEO Reed Hastings was renting a movie from a local DVD rental company, but because he forgot to return the movie on time, he ended up having to pay a hefty late fee of $40. It was such a bad customer experience, but Hastings realized that the late fees were actually a huge source of revenue for these DVD rental companies. Hastings felt that there's something wrong with this business model and he could probably do better. And so the idea for Netflix was born. Although this sounds like a classic success story perfect for a Hollywood movie, the reality is that launching a business is rarely as simple as just coming up with a great idea. So what is the true story behind Netflix? Let's take a trip back in time to the early days of the internet boom in the 1990s. Back in the day, any company with .com in its name could easily find investors willing to pour millions of dollars into it, as there was a lot of hype and excitement around the potential of the internet. And among all these people trying to strike it rich were Reed Hastings and Marc Randolph, the two co-founders of Netflix. At the time, Reed Hastings was running a software development tool company called Pure Atria, and after Hastings' company acquired Marc Randolph's startup Integrity QA, the two became friends, and often taking turns driving to work together. On their way to work, they would often talk about new potential business ideas. With 15 years of experience in marketing, Marc Randolph wanted to combine his past marketing experience with the new medium of the internet. So he came up with ideas like selling custom baseball bats online, or selling custom dog food, or custom surfboards. As Marc Randolph recalls, these products seem so unrelated, but they have two commonalities. First, they're all sold online. Second, the products are all subscription-based. It seems like from the very beginning, Netflix has buried the online and subscription genes. After thinking of nearly 100 ideas, they came up with the video rental business through Reed Hastings' bad experience. As veteran entrepreneurs, they knew they needed to validate the idea with research and experiment. So that's what they did. Back then, the common videotapes on the market were called VHS tapes, and almost every family had a Blockbuster videotape rental store within a 5 to 15-minute drive. Hastings and Randolph knew they had to do something different in order to stand out from their competitors. So they were thinking, could we do a videotape rental through an e-commerce model? Like users order online and then Netflix would mail the tapes directly to their homes instead of going to the stores. Well, after some calculation, the two co-founders found that they would have to rent a videotape 80 times to reach break-even point. But the problem is, the VHS tapes were expensive and prone to damage during shipping. Moreover, when you rent a movie that many times to make money, it's no longer trending, which means nobody wants to watch it anymore. That's a bit discouraging, but just when they were about to give up, they found out about this new technology called DVD. At the time, DVDs were fairly new and hadn't quite hit the market yet, but Hastings and Randolph recognized its massive potential as it would be perfect for their budding company. They are much lighter than VHS, which means ultra-low shipping costs and wear and tear. So Hastings and Randolph did a trial run. A DVD cost about $20, and it takes 32 cents to mail one. And sure enough, when Reed received the test copies of their first sent DVD rentals in his mailbox, he knew that they had made the right choice. In April 1998, Netflix officially went live. However, things took an unexpected turn soon after its launch. Rather than using the site to rent movies and TV shows as intended, many customers choose to purchase DVDs instead. At the time, 99% of Netflix's revenue came from DVD sales, and things were looking even more uncertain when major e-commerce giant Amazon announced that they would begin selling DVDs online a few months later. This meant that Netflix was going head-to-head with Amazon in the DVD rental space. a battle they were almost certainly destined to lose given their relative small size compared to Amazon. With their back against the wall, Reed Hastings and Marc Randolph had no choice but to approach Jeff Bezos, CEO of Amazon, and negotiate a potential acquisition deal. While Bezos was interested in buying Netflix, they couldn't agree on the right price, and ultimately the deal fell through. As the two co-founders left Amazon on their way out, they were more convinced that there's no way Netflix could compete against Amazon after seeing how dark and dingy yet powerful Amazon's office was. Although the company's rental business was still very small and couldn't support the company's operations, they knew they had to put their limited resource into one of the businesses, or both of them would fail. Doing both rental and retail at the same time not only confused customers but also made operations more difficult. To this end, the two finally made a bold decision to reject Amazon's acquisition and abandon their retail business, which accounted for 99% of the total revenue. The two veteran entrepreneurs were convinced that the only way to beat the giant is to focus on one thing and only pay attention to business that makes them different from others, that is, DVD rental business. Of course, at such a critical moment, Hastings and Randolph also tried their best to keep the company alive. For example, Netflix made a deal with Sony that everyone who purchased the Sony DVD player could rent 3 DVDs for free on Netflix, which bought Netflix a considerable amount of new customers, and also helped Sony's customers to find more DVD content. After Hastings and Randolph began to focus on the DVD rental business, they came up with a new payment method, subscription-based monthly plan, so that users would never have to worry about late fees again. Though we are all familiar and comfortable with subscription service now, 20 years ago, it was a very novel business model, and it took Hastings and Randolph countless brainstorming sessions and arguments to come up with it. So now, Netflix faced another tough choice. Much like the decision to sell or rent before, the two founders were debating whether to put the resources into subscription model or the mainstream single rental by rental model. The subscription model had more future potential but didn't generate enough income to cover expenses currently, and they were also worried that many users wouldn't accept a pure subscription model since data show that even with the subscription, many users would still rent one disc at a time based on their usage habits. When faced with this situation, how would you choose? For them, you might have guessed the answer already. They eventually canceled their single rental payment method and focused on subscription model only. It's often said that you should focus on one thing, but it's easier said than done, especially for a startup that might not have the luxury of focusing on the thing they want if it cannot generate enough money to support its operations. And for Netflix, the company's prospects are indeed far from optimistic. The company has been on the brink of bankruptcy several times. In 2000, Netflix had around 300,000 users and was losing $57 million a year, while its main competitor, Blockbuster, was generating $5 billion in revenue and had a net margin of over 10%. At this point, Netflix hardly stood a chance. Reed Hastings even proposed selling 49% of the company to Blockbuster and renaming it Blockbuster.com. At first, the negotiations seemed to be going well as both sides actually were interested in reaching this deal. Netflix was losing money and badly needed external financing, while Blockbuster wanted to get into the online business and saw Netflix as the best acquisition target. However, all of this momentum came to a crashing halt when active investor Carl Icahn entered the scene. He bought up large amounts of Blockbuster stock and took a seat on its board of directors, introducing a host of cost-cutting ideas that conflicted with its plans for online expansion. So after the deal failed, Netflix was faced with an uphill battle to stay afloat. They had to cut costs dramatically by laying off 40% of their workforce and were forced to turn to outside investors for funding. Despite these setbacks, Netflix managed to preserve through sheer determination and savvy connections established by its founder, Reed Hastings. Through these investments and strategic partnerships, Netflix was able to continue building up its service and making improvements that would help it stay competitive over the long term. For example, they realized that one of the major sources of customer churn was due to delays in shipping times. To solve this problem, they began investing in their own distribution center so that DVDs could be delivered more quickly to customers throughout the day. Netflix's success is actually a great example of the importance of innovation. Remember the story of Kodak? 30 years ago, Kodak was the leader in the film industry and had essentially been unchallenged for decades. So when digital cameras began to emerge as a viable alternative to conventional film cameras, Kodak failed to pivot to embrace its new technology. The problem was that adapting Adopting this new technology meant they had to abandon their long-established advantages in the film market, advantages that they simply couldn't afford to lose. The profits from selling films made it difficult for Kodak to make truly disruptive innovations, and ultimately they were forced to put in incremental improvements rather than disruptive innovation. Just like the camera manufacturer, Netflix was once struggling to keep up with the changing technological trends that might disrupt their pre-existing business model. They gave up the retail business to focus on rentals, even if it meant losing 99% of the sales. They also had to take a leap of faith in the subscription payment plan, even if it was against the shopping norm back then. And that's not all of it. In 2007, Reed Hastings invested $40 million to create a streaming product called Watch Now. At the time, streaming technology was still quite rudimentary, with insufficient bandwidth to support it effectively. But despite these challenges, Reed remained steadfast in his belief that streaming is the future of media consumption. By 2011, Reed had again made an unorthodox decision that proved to be truly visionary. He had split off Netflix's lucrative DVD sales business into its own entity, dedicating the Netflix brand exclusively to streaming. The move proved to be incredibly successful, with Netflix's user base rapidly growing from 20 million in 2010 to over 44 million just 2 years later. In less than 2 years, Netflix has once again shifted its focus, this time away from third-party content and towards creating its own exclusive original content. For many years prior, Netflix had relied on movies and shows produced by third-party partners. However, as the prices for these movies continued to climb, Netflix was forced to look elsewhere for quality content. By investing in original content creation itself, Netflix was able to ensure long-term growth and success for the company. Nobody can ever know for sure what ideas would be successful and what ideas would fail. As the co-founder Randolph mentioned in his book, when he first pitched the idea of renting DVDs to his wife, she replied, "That will never work." And yet, here we are today. If you're interested in finding out more about Netflix's story, be sure to check out the link below. This is Money Therapy, a channel dedicated to helping you become a millionaire. Stay tuned for our next video.